The nutritional value of U.S. soybean meal in general is a little bit greater than that of soybean meal from Brazil and Argentina, and the reason we know that is that U.S. soybean meal contains a little bit more crude protein and specifically a little bit more amino acids in the surveys we have seen published over the last few years. So the soybean meal coming from the United States typically has a little bit greater concentrations of the nutrients that we are really looking for pigs and poultry. In addition, there's been a couple of experiments conducted where the digestibility of amino acids and the digestibility of energy was determined, and in both of those experiments it was determined that the digestibility of amino acids is a little bit greater in soybean meal from the United States compared with soybean meal from Argentina and Brazil. And for the energy, the same was the case. We had more energy in the soybean meal from United States than from Brazil and Argentina. The reason we like to use soybean meal in our diets for pigs and poultry is that soybean meal contains less fiber than canola meal, distillers grains, sunflower meals, and some of those ingredients. So when we get amino acids from soybean meals, we primarily get the amino acids and not a lot of fiber. And that is important in both feeding of poultry and pigs, because pigs and poultry don't handle the fibers very well. So that is an advantage for the soybean meal compared with the other sources of amino acids that we have available to us. In addition, we've also seen that the digestibility of nutrients, in particular amino acids, in soybean meal is less variable than in canola meal and DDGS and sunflower meal. So when a producer or a feed mill includes soybean meal in the formula, he or she knows what is coming, because it's not a very variable product, unlike some of the other protein sources, and that's also an advantage for the soybean meal. The differences in the nutritional value of soybean meal between soybean meal from the United States and Brazilian or Argentinian soybean meal is a combination of the increased digestibility of amino acids and the increased concentration of amino acids that we have in U.S. soybean meal. And for a feed formulator, that means that if he loads values for soybean meal, he really should have one value for U.S. soybean meal and one value for Brazilian soybean meal and one value for Argentinian soybean meal, and then have the proper nutritional value for each of those meals. So if he does that, then he can capture that extra value in U.S. soybean meal, because it would directly translate to having to use a little bit less of the U.S. soybean meal compared with Brazilian or Argentinian soybean meal in the formula if he formulates to a certain level of digestible amino acids, which all commercial producers and all commercial feed mills will do. So by having the correct loading values in the formulation system for each of those sources of soybean meal, he will capture the added economic value of U.S. soybean meal. One thing that is also increasing the value of U.S. soybean meal is the fact that we now know that there's actually more metabolizable energy and more net energy in soybean meal in general produced in the United States compared with what we have previously believed there was. So we have seen that in a number of experiments conducted during the last few years, we have consistently been able to demonstrate that there is more available energy than previously thought and what is currently in our book values. That has a direct economic implication also if the correct values are used in diet formulations, because by having a greater energy concentration in soybean meal than what we previously thought there would be, we have now seen that we need to use less of other energy sources in the formulation. So that also will have an economic advantage for adding soybean meal to the diets. So we believe that the energy that soybean meal provides for pigs in a diet is almost 10% greater than what we have previously seen in book values. The reason it's important that we have low variability in our feed ingredients is that we typically formulate diets to contain a certain amount of energy and a certain amount of digestible amino acids. And in the formulation, we assume a certain value in each ingredient, and then the diet contains a combination of all those different ingredients. If there's a lot of variability among each ingredient and within each ingredient, then it becomes more challenging to predict what the mixed final product will actually contain. So if you use average values in the formulation and you believe that you will get a certain value in your mixed diet, if that average is not reached in the particular batch of the ingredient that you are including in the diet, then you will not be able to mix a diet that has the value that you assumed it would have. So variability is really difficult to handle in the feed mixing business. And that's why if you have less variability and that will increase your ability to predict what you will have in the final diet, which is what we all want to do. We have some new sources of soybean meal available to us, and those sources are typically used in diets for early weaned pigs and in starter diets for poultry. And the reason we use different sources of soybean products in these diets is that conventional soybean meal is not very well utilized by the very young animals. And so by using new sources of soybean meal, we can actually use soybean meal in these early diets instead of having to use fish meal or other animal protein sources. And some of the soybean meals we have available to us include soy protein concentrates and also fermented soybean meal and enzyme-treated soybean meal. And all of these sources can be well utilized by young pigs, so we can use soy protein as the only source of amino acids basically from the pigs are weaned and all the way to slaughter. But we do need to use those enzyme-treated or fermented soybean products early on in the life, or soy protein concentrate for that matter. But it is important that we use some of these enhanced soybean meals in the starter diets for both pigs and poultry.